Welcome to the History of the Batman with Londyn, brought to you by Meltdown Comics and Collectibles in Hollywood, California. This is where we relive the defining moments of one of the most iconic figures in comic art and literature, the Batman. My name is Adam Silverstein, and as always, I am joined by Londyn, and from the shadows, we have Shadow Adam. This week on the History of the Batman, we are going to have a retrospect on creators of Batman within the last 75 years at DC Comics. But before we get there, I would like to introduce or say hello to you, Londyn. I mean, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good. That was a great episode last week we had on Bane.
My favorite.
Your favorite. And when we left and, stopped the show, ended the show, we did not ask whether our producer engineer Mason had been converted to a Bane fan. Mason?
No. I'm sorry.
Still not a fan? I mean, do you
I will say I'm intrigued that he got with Talia. I think that is astounding to me because, she is my favorite Batman love interest.
Okay.
And if we can get a show about Batman's many love interests,
Ooh.
I would be a fan.
I
of
would
that.
love to do that.
So there is a request, Batman's love interests. That's a good
He's
one.
Gotta have. Who knows how many? I don't even know. But Talia is amazing, and if she's willing to get with Bane, all right, I'll give it. Bane.
She's willing to get with you, is what you're saying.
Bane?
No, you. If Talia would get with Bane, she'd get with you.
I guess so.
Okay.
Because I'm not a drugged out freak. I'm just saying I'm impressed. If he must have something.
She just fulfills a fantasy.
She's not willing to just go with anybody. So
Right.
I'll give it that. But
So can we at least say this, that you learned something last week?
oh, absolutely. I learn stuff every week.
Okay.
Awesome.
And I will say this, I admit, in the first instance of Bane, when he first came out, yes, he was amazing and he beat Batman and that was great. But after that, and I don't think you really addressed this, after that, he's just so easily defeated ever since.
Right.
It's like a throwaway.
It's definitely not as intense as Nightfall, no. So, but with the other stories that Bane has, I think you just get a little bit more insight into who he is. It may not be the backbreaking guy, but you still get to learn a little bit more of how he's involved in the DC universe and Batman's mythos.
All right. Well, so Londyn, tell me a little bit about what the genesis of this week's episode is.
Well, it's based off of actually the feedback that a lot of times I get on Instagram.com/History of the Batman, where people will comment and say, I really want to get into Batman comics. I've never read Batman comics before, but either from the post or just in general, they want to start reading about his stories. And I usually give, a list. I usually direct them to this great list that DCComics.com has. It's called Batman 101, and it goes down a few, a list of just Batman stories that are essential to his history. And I thought I would kind of do that in a different way, where we'll go decade by decade and we'll highlight two creators, whether they're writers or artists or both, and discuss what they have done and how they've contributed to Batman and why their work is so significant that they should be almost the representations of that era and that decade itself.
Now, I don't want you to spoil anything right now, but do you have a favorite creator?
I do.
Without telling me who, because I want.
I do. I have about maybe 3 different artists that I really enjoy. It's hard to decide which one I like the most, but Brian Boland, he's not on our list because I didn't want to be biased, but Brian Boland is one of my favorite artists, and I really like Kelly Jones. He is more Batman horror genre. And I'm a huge horror comics freak. I really love all the, like the EC Comics and like Tales from the Crypt and all of those kind of, stories. And I think he really brings that into Batman. And my favorite writer, I would probably say, is Grant Morrison.
Oh, you spoiled it.
I know. And he actually is on our list. And it's not because I like him, but he actually he's very profound in the Batman story. So we'll talk about that.
So now when you're talking about creators that we're going to talk about in each decade, are we talking about artists and writers? Are we talking about them separately or the creation that they came with together?
It's a little bit of all of that. I mean, some are just separate, some are just they're two different writers, and some are two different artists. But then in certain decades, they're kind of a combo pack, like especially when we look in the 70s. Those two creators definitely work together to bring something new to Batman that I think is really significant.
So you'll just be talking about two creators that you find to be impactful in the Batman comic book world.
Definitely. And I'm sure there are people listening that when I say the two, they'll say, oh, you didn't talk about this person or this person. There are dozens of people in each decade that you can pretty much talk about, but I picked two that I think are significant.
Okay. And so where do we start? Do we start at 1939?
Yep, we will just start with that year since it's the year that Batman was debuted, and I have Bob Kane and Bill Finger as my two creators for this year. Just to give a little background, Bob Kane, before he started Batman, he was a comic strips creator. He did Westerns and Pulp Fiction comics and just different, kind of stuff that was in Detective Comics, that kind of like, dark tales and things. And once Superman was created in 1938, the DC editor at the time, which was National Publications, Vin Sullivan, he went to Bob Kane, and who was the artist, and he wanted him to create a hero that would stand kind of alongside Superman. And he went, he had a lot of inspirations from The Mask of Zorro and kind of like that kind of dark vigilante hero to designs such as Leonardo da Vinci's flying machine. And he created this character who was almost like, in style, a carbon copy look of Superman. He kind of had the red costume. In his first drawings, he had a domino mask, and he kind of had blondish hair, and he's kind of swinging from a rope, and he called him the Bat-Man. And so from that point, he created the Batman, that character. He signed a contract with National Publications for the rights to Batman, and however Batman proceeded, he would get all of the artistic, creative credit for any comic he would be in the future. And then once they saw the design, Sullivan asked ghostwriter Bill Finger to come in, and he gave some changes to the design to Bob Kane, and that included a different color scheme. He had the blue and gray costume, the kind of wing-like cape was changed to kind of a flowing cape, and he had a cowl and not just a domino mask, and he wore these gloves. And the reason more for the gloves is because Bill Finger, while Bob Kane had him as a more vigilante, a dark, avenger, Bill Finger wanted him to be more of a detective. He wanted to be more like Sherlock Holmes. And so he said the gloves were important to him because he wouldn't leave any fingerprints when he was on the crime scenes. And so with Bob Kane's vigilante and Bill Finger's detective mushed together pretty much Batman, and he debuted in Detective Comics Volume 1, number 27, with a cover date of May 1939. So pretty much they both worked together on most of the first year of Batman comics. And of course, the first one, I guess the first comic we would talk about is his debut, because Bob Kane did the pencils and the inks and the cover, and Bill Finger was the writer. And it's the case of the Chemical Syndicate, which over the past 75 plus years has been redone and given an homage and, written again by many different writers. And in a nutshell, you are introduced to Commissioner Gordon. You're introduced to, at the time, millionaire, since it was 1939, millionaire Bruce Wayne, and pretty much Bruce Wayne has to transform into the Batman to solve several murders that this businessman Stryker is committing to try to take all of the other businesses for himself. And in the end, Batman has to solve the case and find him and bring him to justice. And then at the end of the issue, you discover that Bruce Wayne and Batman are one and the same. Commissioner Gordon has no idea that he's Batman or anything. He just thinks that he is a weird socialite and, thinks that his life is dull and boring, which is definitely a theme that goes along with early comics, especially with Bruce Wayne having a fiance and thinking that, he's boring and he doesn't have a life outside of just being a playboy. And that really shows in a lot of different stories. So that one, the combo of Bob Kane and Bill Finger, brought a beautiful start to an incredible history that Batman has. And for Bob Kane, he did pencils and ink to one of the first stories that had Batman facing a supervillain of sorts, and it's called Dr. Death, and that was in Detective Comics 28 and 29. And pretty much Dr. Death is pretty much like a mad scientist, and he is trying to kill several different Gothamites and people in Gotham, and Batman has to go head-to-head with his henchmen, and then he finds Dr. Death, and in the first part, the whole laboratory goes up in huge flames and fire, and it's visually stunning. I mean, considering you don't really see that kind of intensity even in the first, issue. The fact that he's facing someone who has these kind of weird potions and he's more than just a crook. He is someone who is very harmful to Batman. And in the last part of the issue, he's considered dead because he burned in the fire. But then in issue 29 in part 2, where Bob Kane still does the pencils and the inks and the cover, he discovers that Dr. Death has been, disguised as another man, and he tracks him down and, unmasks him, and then he puts him in prison. And that story, I mean, you really see Bob Kane, kind of, even though people, are like, oh, he didn't invent Batman because Bill Finger changed the design. I mean, Bob Kane still was a very important illustrator, and he really did showcase Batman as this pulp vigilante figure that he originally saw in Zorro when he was first creating that. And so Bill Finger, of course, is definitely important, not just in 1939, but he continues to write stories in the 40s and the 50s in the golden age and silver age of comics. But definitely the debut of Batman and the first kind of arc, part 1 and 2 of Batman and Dr. Death are definitely issues I think people who want to start getting into comics should read, especially since they're the first ones, and you can really see Batman in his original form.
Right, and I mean, even introducing Commissioner Gordon in that first issue, I mean, that's huge. I mean, he goes on to play such a major role.
Right, and he begins to play a major role in the late 40s. I mean, it takes less than a decade for Commissioner Gordon to be an important part of Batman's almost family. He helps and aids Batman. At first he's kind of put off and thinks he's just this crazy guy dressed up in a suit running around and taking away the jobs from the police. But then he sees that he's really trying to do good and he's on his side. And, he kind of convinces the rest of the police force that he's someone that helps us, not necessarily hinders what we do. So it's really interesting that he's in the very first comic, even though he has a kind of small role.
I didn't even realize that he had that small of a role, and then it ultimately grew.
Right.
Was there any other characters that had that Kane and Finger created?
I mean, there's dozens. I mean, I guess originally the Joker's one that they created along with Jerry Robinson, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then they created Catwoman, and they created pretty much a lot of the early characters. I mean, like the Penguin, like those three, the Joker, Catwoman, Penguin, and then Two-Face later. They're all created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, and depending on which one, maybe another creator. But they created the main Batman family, and including Dick Grayson, who's Robin. So the first early people or, reoccurring characters that existed in 1939, the early 40s, those two definitely had an importance in bringing them to life. And so that's why I think they're really significant, because they pretty much started Batman.
Now, I do have one question for you.
Okay.
Batman versus the Batman. What is that? I keep on saying history of the Batman, but I also see Batman. Why is it the versus no the?
And that's why when I first started the Instagram page, I called it History of the Batman, because when he started, they called him the and then Bat-Man. And that lasted for probably the first 5 issues. And then he just went to being Batman. So I'm not sure exactly why that changed, but when he was first created, that's what they called him. And that's why I like to keep it as the Batman, because that's how he started. And,
I like that. Pays homage to, the beginning.
Exactly.
Thank you for explaining that, because I've kind of been just didn't ever think to ask the question until right now. We're talking about the creators, and so I think that
I personally like the Batman.
I like it too. No, it sounds official. It sounds intimidating.
Right.
I mean, Batman is one thing, but the Batman.
Right. Even in the first issue, chapter 27, when they're on top of the roof and there are these 2 crooks, they see him for the first time. They're like, "Watch out! It's the Batman." I mean, every time someone sees him, they say it's the Batman. It's not necessarily just Batman. So I always found that that's like, it's the Batman. It's the one guy.
Right.
Yeah.
I also wonder if it's just because maybe that was the first time he's on the scene,
Right.
And then eventually he's always on the scene, and
so
he's
then
always
they call him
we're familiar with you now. You're not just the Batman.
Exactly.
You're Batman. So 1939, we talk about Bill Finger and Bob Kane.
Right.
Obviously, as you said, huge contributors, the main contributors, and still standing the test of time. Let's move into the 40s. What other... unless you've got something else to add to Kane and Finger.
I think that pretty much covers it. They were, they're pretty much pioneers of Batman and his rogues gallery and just how he began. So that's why I picked those 2 for the first year. It
may also be a nice show to do just profiles on the creators themselves.
Oh, definitely.
Not because in this episode, we're really focusing on the creators and what things they contributed.
Exactly.
Versus just a profile on the contributors or the creators. And I think that would be fascinating because
definitely.
Bob Kane and Bill Finger, these, and Robinson as well, these gentlemen almost deserve an entire podcast on just them.
Yes, definitely. That's definitely a full episode that they can definitely contribute to. So yeah, that'd be something we could talk about in the future for sure.
Right. So let's move on to the 40s, and you had picked Dickspring and Jerry Robinson?
Yes, I picked those 2.
And why did you pick them?
I picked them because they both really contributed to a lot of not only first, appearances of characters, but just the art and the writing and the stories themselves that kind of really started to build what Batman represented, what was in, what kind of gadgets, what type of villains, kind of his almost look in the 1940s were based off of these 2 artists. I am a fan of Dickspring. I really like Golden Age of comics. I like the 40s and the early 50s. And I like Dickspring as an artist. And pretty much for most of these creators that we'll talk about, most of them started, they're in New York City, and then they started, on comic strips and small Western comics, and then they were called upon DC to, write or ink for them and create new characters. And that's the same with Dickspring. He started in pulp magazines and, different comic strips, and then in 1941, he was hired by Vin Sullivan, who was the DC editor, to kind of it's interesting because it kind of takes an out of comic book context. During this time in 1941, the DC editors weren't sure if Bob Kane, who was the main artist, was going to be drafted into World War II. And so, since there was a huge possibility he wouldn't be able to do the comics, they hired Dickspring to kind of almost take his place just in case they wouldn't be able to get that art or those comics out because he would be drafted. But since then, Dickspring kind of just stuck around, and his first interior work was in Batman number 19 from November 1943. And I mean, it's not really a spectacular story or anything. It's a Batman versus Joker type of, crazy rendezvous. But just the fact that he first drew his Joker, which his Joker is very significant. The way his jawline is and his smile and just the kind of way that he looks, it's a very distinctive style. In the same way as Batman, he kind of has the square jaw, the kind of squished Batman emblem on his chest, and it's interesting enough, he kind of smiles more than he did in the last year, 1939, because of course, when he was by himself, his almost literal year one in 1939, he was by himself. He didn't have Dick Grayson yet until Detective Comics 38 from April of 1940. So he had a whole year of being this dark pulp fiction character that used a gun and killed and was just on his own. It was just kind of being kind of like the Lone Ranger. But now that Robin is there, they kind of get to play around a little bit, and he is more lighthearted. But you see him, when you see Dickspring's Batman, okay, that's Dickspring's work. That's Dickspring's style. And then another issue that's really interesting, especially people who are fans of the Batmobile, in Batman Volume 1, number 20 from 1943, I think it's December 1943, might be January 1944, depending on the printing, Dickspring created the cover, and it's the first time the Batmobile is on the cover ever. And it's still Jerry Robinson, who we'll talk about next. It's still his original design. It's kind of a black car with a red racing stripe on the side. It has a bat emblem like grill and a huge back fin, and it's very dramatic. It has like a huge, pretty much bat symbol on every piece of the car. But the cover itself is very exciting because the Batmobile bursts through the covers and you see Batman and Robin inside the car, and you see almost bullet holes within the window, which means some crook just shot up the car. And even before you turn the pages, you see this exciting moment where Batman and Robin are in action and they're in the Batmobile, which before it was like a convertible or, just a regular kind of sports car that Bruce Wayne drove. But now it's a literal Batmobile. So Dickspring did a lot of covers that, really illustrated rogues like the Penguin and the Joker and Batman and Robin, and just kind of gave an almost fun, exciting style for readers to see before they open up the pages and see what the comic is about. So I think Dickspring as a whole, especially in the 1940s, he had a really big part of kind of giving a distinguished look to the golden age of Batman and how he looked.
Wow, he did quite a bit then.
You were telling me that he wasn't credited originally on the cover because of the contract?
Because of Bob Kane's contract, definitely. And that just doesn't go for Dickspring. That goes with Jerry Robinson, Sheldon Moldoff, Charles Paris, George Rousseau. All of the artists and not writers, mostly. Bill Finger was so credited, but in terms of art, since Bob Kane was many times, he was the cover artist and the pencils and inks, due to his contract, that's why no one was really credited. It just said Bob Kane. Even though, I'm talking about Dickspring, and there are tons and tons of comics he's inked and he's done covers to, you would never know. And you don't really discover that until, I think, 1964. So there's about 2 decades worth of artists who are uncredited for their work because Bob Kane pretty much signed an exclusive contract that says any type of art formed by the character I created, I get all the credit. So that's why a lot of people today, and especially the artists' families, kind of have an upheave against Bob Kane, because all of the work that they've done for so long was uncredited. Even though today it's a different story, you know, everyone's credited. But at the time, it was just different back
What
then.
happened in 64?
Well, 64, they pretty much the contract was pretty much canceled, and it was an updated one was written because it was from 1939, 1964, and that's when they pretty much put out all of the people who contributed to the art, and that's when you found out, you know, Dickspring did it, and Jerry Robinson, and, you know, different writers like Don Cameron, and just all of these people who were so influential in the Golden Age and the Silver Age that didn't get their, you know, their names on the things they created. So there's a lot of drama. That's why I said, like you said, I can go on a whole episode just talking about Bob Kane and Bill Finger and just the background that they have done and what kind of things happen within National Publications, DC Comics.
Right. I mean,
sure.
I think it would be fascinating to kind of go over the legal issues, the ownership issues of all the creators, because, you know, nowadays, and rightfully so, you should be credited.
Right, exactly.
And I'm always a big believer in, you know, respecting the artist, respecting the creator, and making sure that they're included in the success of whatever they're doing.
Right.
And people should know, and that's now a thing. But, you know, I think paying respect to the creators and the originators and the, you know, early pioneers is a worthwhile show.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me about Jerry Robinson then.
Jerry Robinson, he did tons of comics and covers and, you know, interior work. But for Jerry Robinson, he's most known for contributing to, of course, the Joker is the first one, even though he helped create Robin. And even if it's in the slightest way, when Bob Kane and Bill Finger were trying to figure out a sidekick for Batman, Jerry Robinson was the person who suggested that they should name him Robin after the hero Robin Hood. So even little things like that are very important. And he's also credited to creating the Joker. He saw Conrad Veidt's performance in The Man Who Laughs and liked his aesthetics and the way that he looked and thought that it would be great to use this type of grotesque figure to be a kind of villain, and he wanted him to be like the arch nemesis to Batman. So for that, and the Joker premiered in Batman #1 from spring of 1940, and the Joker just celebrated that 75th anniversary this past April 25th. It's marked 75 years, and you know, we've talked about this story before in other episodes, but you know, the Joker just is a mass murderer, and he's killing everyone, announcing it through radio waves and saying that I'm going to kill this person at this time, and Batman and Robin pretty much have to stop from all of the killings that Joker has done, even though he's successfully killed about 4 people. And so that already established him as this, you know, mad murderer with a smile on his face. And he's done, I mean, tons, especially in the 40s and the 50s. And he is an important character, it's an important creator for actually Alfred, who was first named Alfred Beagle, and he looks completely different than the Alfred we know already. I mean, he was kind of a short, stubby man with, you know, balding head, and he was still their butler. But he created or helped with the creation of that, and then once the serials came out in 1943, they changed Alfred Beagle to look like the Alfred Pennyworth we know today, the tall, slender, you know, black tie, you know, slick back hair butler. So Jerry Robinson's important because he's contributed tons of comic book covers and inks and even characters, from Robin to Joker to Alfred to even Two-Face. He's helped in the creation of those characters, and those are reoccurring figures that are still in today. And I mean, I think anyone can probably argue that he's an important creator, not just in the 40s, but he's been in the 50s and the 60s. He pretty much ended in the early 60s with his run, but he's pretty much created tons of characters that are important to Batman's history.
What are some other, can you give me a few other characters or creations that Robinson came up with?
Pretty much it's been, like I said, he helped with Dick Grayson and the character, the
And
actual
Alfred
character
and-
Robin, yeah.
But anyone else that we're missing? Any?
I mean, I'm sure there are tons. I mean, I don't believe that he helped create Catwoman, who was in the same debut issue as Joker. But though I think the big four, at least in the early years, are Robin, Joker, Two-Face, or Harvey Kent, and then they went to Harvey Dent, and then Alfred. He helped with those, and those are all, I think, really important characters. So, yeah, I think for the 40s, those two creators, I think they really stood out. Of course, there are tons of other creators like Jack Burnley and George Rousseau that helped in the 40s, but I think those two really stand out and are even celebrated today for their work in this time period.
Wow. All right, so next we'd be moving on to the 50s, but before we do, I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsor, comicsfix.com. That's F-I-X, Comics Fix. It's unlimited comic books on a digital platform. So you can actually read these comics. If you pay $8.99 a month, you can actually try for free to start off with. And then you can just read as many comics as your heart's desire. Good service. It's like the Netflix of digital comics. You can get it on your computer, on your tablet, on your phone. So check out comicsfix.com to get started. All right. So now back to the subject at hand. Or are we done with Jerry Robinson?
Yep, I think we covered Jerry Robinson. I'm ready to go to the 1950s.
All right, do 50. And so for the 50s, you picked Charles Paris and Sheldon Moldoff.
Yes.
Not two of the... They're not as known as the first four, but they obviously have contributed to the Batman canon.
Definitely. And those two artists are definitely ones that were uncredited in their original, productions of comics. And, Bob Kane pretty much was the person that did all the art. So I think that's a big reason why, they may not be as well known. And even though they're not as, known as Jerry Robinson or Dickspring or Bill Finger, they are very important into Batman's progression and even into building Batman's family, the Batman family. So first is Charles Paris. I mean, he's from New York, and he even worked on another hero, the Crimson Avenger, in Detective Comics. He did that until 1941. And then he, along with Bob Kane, they both inked and penciled on Batman comic strips because Batman wasn't just in comic books, but he was also in New York newspaper comic strips. And that was for about 3 years until 1946. And then Charles Paris was, working on Batman comics. And then he created, kind of Silver Age characters that kind of went away after the reboot. But he was the person that created Batmite. And he was created in Detective Comics 267, and that was in late 1950s, 1959. And I'm sure you guys have seen Batmite on cartoons such as Batman the Brave and the Bold and in comics, but he's pretty much this magical imp, I guess, from the fifth dimension that has all of these powers and is obsessed with Batman and the hero that he is. And pretty much anytime he appears in comics, Batman gets annoyed with him and he just goes away. He's kind of like a very gimmicky, very fun-loving character. Definitely something or a character that represents what the 1950s were. The Silver Age era was very lighthearted. It was bright. It was fun. And especially with the Comic Codes Authority in place in 1954, comics can be as dark. Characters couldn't be as, the villains that they really were created to be. And so Batmite was a very, is a kind of a standard, character that you would see in Silver Age comics. And he also did, just other issues, early ones like Batman, number 40. And he worked along with Sheldon Moldoff, and he worked along with Bill Finger, the writer, and they pretty much, they did art that was either covers or, panels that pretty much represented that kind of fascination with, science fiction and just kind of represented at that time, the Silver Age. And I like Charles Paris's work, and he's kind of like one of the unsung heroes, the kind of the hidden in the shadows. You don't really know about him unless you really look into it. But he was just as influential as Dickspring and Jerry Robinson in terms of, adding people to the Batman family.
I think this Batmite character is, I have a vivid memory of him from the cartoons, from the early cartoons.
Yes.
It was the New Adventures of Batman.
Yes, the New Adventures of Batman. He was with Batgirl and Batman and Robin, and he was just, a very silly character, poof in and out, and, would use his powers to help, but he was pretty much just an annoyance.
Did you watch the Flintstones?
Yes.
I remember it being like the little kazoo.
Yeah, he called them Dum Dum.
Yeah. But
pretty much just like that. And that's still in the same kind of era too.
Yeah, Batmite though. Has Batmite ever taken a serious role? Or has it always kind of been that?
There have been later like comics, especially like in the 90s and 2000s, where he's done like issues where he has to fight to like keep his race kind of alive, and he asks Batman to help, and then some of his, people from his universe die. And there have been certain stories where it's gotten a little darker than just hanging around with Batman and idolizing him. But for the most part, that's why he was created. And it kind of, goes the same with when we talk about Sheldon Moldoff. He was an artist, he was a penciler and an inker, and sometimes did covers. And, he was active in the 1940s. He worked for different publications. He created a character called Black Pirate in 1940, and he was a ghost artist in the same, like I said before, he was uncredited by Bob Kane. But he is important not just to Batman, but he was the first to draw the DC characters Hawkman and Hawkgirl. And he also just created many other Batman rogues and characters. One, Calendar Man, which I think is one of my favorites. And now they made them all kind of dark, especially after Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale's Long Halloween from '97. He's just all dark and mean. But before, like, he had a nice costume and had the calendar, like, pages all over him. And he would fight with, calendar pages, and would just, he's a very fun character. He would commit crimes on holidays, and he's a very fun character, created in the 50s, still kind of, the same lightheartedness. But Sheldon Moldoff also created Ace the Bat Hound, who debuted in Batman 92 from 1955. And of course, it's like, Batman having a dog. He's like his best friend, not to be funny, but he was, they found him. He's a German Shepherd, and then the dog helps them, solve the crime, and because his owner is being taken hostage, and so once they find the owner, he says, if any time you need help from the Bat Hound, you can call. And then in later issues, he pretty much becomes part of the Batman family. He's always in the Batcave. He'll go on, missions sometimes, and like I said, it's just very fun.
Does he wear a cute Batman costume?
He does. He has like a cape, and he has a little domino mask that's like Batman. It has the Batman symbol.
Did he have bat-shaped dog treats?
Probably.
Batarangs.
Batarang dog treats. It's just all very...
I wonder if they played fetch with a Batarang.
But like I said, it's kind of the same thing as Batmite, It's, even though he's an addition to the Batman history and all that, he's part of the Batman family. Every family likes to have a pet. He's pretty much Batman's pet,
I wonder if this was a DC thing. Because didn't Superman...
Krypto.
You're right. Superman had the Superman family, right? Shadow Adam. That's your favorite Superman.
Yeah, he had his own family too.
So, what was this just I wonder if this was DC just reaching out and saying, let's see how much Superman or Batman stuff we can fit on whatever it might be.
And pretty much they, liked the idea of Krypto, the super dog, so they wanted to have something similar, but, to Batman's pace. Because, Krypto, he could fly and all that stuff that Superman can, but now you needed someone who would help him in the lab, in the Batcave, and, chase down the villain and then they catch him. I mean, he's like, the best friend. He's the dog of the family. He's the pet of the family. And Sheldon Moldoff also created Mr. Freeze, who debuted actually as Mr. Zero in Batman 121 from February of 1959. And, the story, it's very simple. He has like this ice ray gun and he's trying to freeze Gotham and everything. But you really don't see him anymore for like probably a few years. I mean, he was kind of like he came and then he kind of left.
Was he kind of a campy type character?
Very much so. He was a very gimmicky character. And that actually didn't even change until, oddly enough, Batman the Animated Series in 1992 in the episode Heart of Ice, where they totally reinvented Mr. Freeze and made him a more sympathetic character and kind of more darker character. He's lost and he loves, his wife Nora, who's in a cryogenic state, and he's trying to find the cure. And ever since then, that origin has been used in the movies and future comics. But yeah, in the 50s and when he was rarely seen in the 60s, definitely when he changed from Mr. Zero to Mr. Freeze, very campy. And that pretty much is the same for most of Batman's villains.
Yeah, in the beginning at least.
Right.
We're talking about the 50s.
Right, in the 50s, that's definitely...
if you got the guy creating Bat Dog, I mean, Mr. Freeze is going to be pretty goofy probably too.
Right, definitely.
But it is, I think another cool thing is that how they can, the modern storytellers have reinterpreted some of these characters. I mean, theoretically, a Bat Dog, could have a role. I mean, he doesn't have to wear a cape or a thing, but people do love dogs, like you said. And
right.
There could be a story where the dog is protecting the owner. He's just not necessarily going to... Or maybe they train the dog to sniff for drugs. I don't know.
Exactly.
But, I mean, there's always a way to retell the story.
And especially having, like the Bat Hound, like a dog within the story, is definitely an appeal to audiences because they're like, hey, I have a dog, or hey, I have a cat. I mean, it's all very light and fun, but it fits perfectly within the 50s era. So even though those two are kind of lesser known artists, I suppose, they're both were very influential into introducing new Batman characters.
And when you really think about it, I mean, so many people, or at least from my generation, still think of that as the primary Batman.
Right.
And so when you kind of make a joke, or when people make a joke like, oh, they created the Bat Dog, or whatever we just said, Batmite. I remember that. That really influenced me, and so I can kind of snicker at it now, but I cannot deny the impact.
Right. I mean, you remember it, even though, like I said, even if you haven't seen them in comics, you've seen the shows, whether they're from like the late 60s or the early 70s, or they're from the 90s, or even especially the late 2000 series, Batman the Brave and the Bold, which it's pretty much paying an homage to the Silver Age of comics anyway. I mean, the Joker in there looks like Dickspring's Joker, and all of these Silver Age characters. Batmite appears in a few episodes, and is definitely the same type of character he was in the comics. I mean, he's an annoyance to Batman. He puts him in these weird situations because he's like, oh, I'm put you in this dangerous situation, but I know you'll be able to get out of it because you're Batman. You're the best hero.
It's a great series for kids.
Yeah, definitely. The Brave and the Bold, that is a great series. And speaking of which, that kind of leads us into the 1960s and the two creators that I've picked. The first is Gardner Fox, who is definitely one of the biggest pioneers of probably DC Comics as a whole. I mean, it's been said that he's written almost over 4,000 comics and just stories. But before he became a comic book writer, I mean, he practiced law, and then once the Great Depression hit, he started writing for DC Comics because he could get work there. And then he was even influential in decades before. In 1939, he was the person who created the design for the Batarang, and he was the person who created the design for Dr. Death, which we talked about in Bob Kane stories from Detective Comics 28 and 29. I mean, he's been impacting comics even in the early eras before. But I think his work in the 1960s was really important to Batman because he is the person who created the Justice League of America. And they debuted in The Brave and the Bold number 28 from February of 1960. And that introduced, the main people of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter, Aquaman, and The Flash. And even though Superman and Batman, in that first story where they have to fight Starro, who's this kind of large starfish-shaped alien that's taking over the world, Superman and Batman, they were kind of considered the leaders, but they literally were too busy to fight Starro with them. Superman was in space beating up asteroids and tried to save them from hitting Earth, whereas Batman was busy driving around Gotham City saving crooks. So it was really the other members that fought Starro and saved the day. And that series became so popular that in the fall, like October, November of the same year, they got their own series, Justice League of America Volume 1. So, of course, we know the Justice League is so important, even still today.
Oh, yeah.
So, the fact that he created this team, that puts the greatest DC heroes at the time together makes them one of the most powerful teams in comic book history.
So, he created the meeting table?
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, that's iconic in its own right.
Right. I mean, pretty much he had a say in all of the kind of iconography that the Justice League kind of has, especially the early ones in the 1960s. So he wrote that in, and he also wrote in a lot of returns to characters that weren't there before, like in Batman 189 from 1967. He wrote back the Scarecrow because Scarecrow premiered in the early 40s, but then once that happened, you didn't see him in another issue. It's kind of like he was almost a non-reoccurring character. I mean, nowadays you think, oh, the Scarecrow is one of Batman's best rogues. He's fun, he has the fear gas, and and he really warps Batman's mind. But at the time, Scarecrow was just, a professor, Jonathan Crane, who kind of went a little nuts, put on a Scarecrow suit and started, attacking people. But he only was in that one issue. But then Gardner Fox Conley wrote him back in the late 60s, and he became a more prominent figure. But definitely, I guess, like we said, looking into the dynamics of the DC Comics publication and how the inner workings, Gardner stopped working for DC in the late 60s, like 68, because they weren't giving him health benefits and all of this other kind of legal, things with him working there. So he stopped working for DC and kind of, was out of the comic business for a while. But the fact that he created Justice League and, wrote stories, especially like in the early 40s, he's a really important writer to the comics. And the same goes for the next artist that's for the 1960s is Carmine Infantino.
Before we get to him,
okay.
You mentioned Starro. Did you ever read Captain Carrot and His Amazing Zoo Crew?
No.
Oh, it was one of my favorite DC comics of all time. And one of the issues that they had was a crossover with an animal DC universe.
Oh,
so there was
wow.
the Bat Mouse. And it was one of my favorite things of all time. But
that sounds awesome.
They fought Starro. And so that's how I learned about Starro was through Captain Carrot and His Amazing Zoo Crew and his team up with the Justice League of Animals, I think it was.
I'm going to have to read that now.
Yeah. I haven't seen it collected, but it is definitely one of my favorites.
Wow, that sounds awesome.
And I think Roy Thomas and Scott Shaw created it. I know Scott Shaw was a part of that. I think Roy Thomas as well. But just fantastic stuff. So
nice.
Animals and character. I just thought it was so great. I mean, I created all these. They had Peter Porker, this amazing Spider Ham, and so I was a kid. I created Daredevil and Track Panther instead of Black Panther. He ran track and had this whole thing. Anyways, but there was a lot of that was influenced by this Bat Mouse. So great stuff. Anyway, sorry. So Carmine
Carmine Infantino.
Okay.
Yes, he is one of my favorite artists too, just in general in this time period. He first actually worked for Timely Comics, which is now known as Marvel Comics. He did pencils and inks for them for a while, and then he came to DC. And during the Golden Age, during the 40s and the early 50s, he worked on Green Lantern and the JLA. But then what he was most, I think even now, he's more known for, besides Batman, is The Flash. And he pretty much, with how he drew, with his kind of vivid lines, he kind of created that red and yellow blur you may see when Flash runs across a panel. And it kind of brought it to life. And he was the one that kind of started taking the kind of very lighthearted, campy, silly stories that Batman and Flash and Wonder Woman and Superman were having. And when he worked on Flash, he kind of brought that kind of science fiction, mystery story into Flash and kind of made it a little bit more of a deeper story. And he kind of initiated a new era of the Silver Age, the era that was kind of not as light, and I think just how he draws was very significant, and it introduced different characters in a new way. The way he had a vertical, horizontal lines, and just the way that he drew, his pen just moved amazingly, different than any other artist that had been seen doing DC before. But I guess two of the most important things that Infantino brought to the Batman mythos was, first, Batman's new look. Now, before, you would see Batman still in the gray and blue type of suit, but he had a black kind of squished bat emblem on his chest. But in Detective Comics 327 from May of 1964, this new look, quote-unquote new look, came, and pretty much that introduced the yellow oval symbol that we all kind of know on Batman's chest. And that was kind of like it was almost like a brighter interpretation of what he looked like. And that really helped DC Comics in general and Detective Comics, because the sales were sinking. They were really low. Like, the Batman and Detective Comics weren't selling as well. And so they wanted to try to change the characters in the comics to try to bring in a new audience and the audience back that they had before. And then, like I said earlier, at this time, now artists were giving credit for their work. And so you knew that Carmine Infantino drew this new look. It wasn't just Bob Kane. And so that was really important. And then a few years later, in 1966, the Batman live-action television series began with Adam West and Burt Ward as Batman and Robin, and that was a huge success. Even in the first season, it spun off a motion picture, and Batmania began, and everyone loved it. And so by the time that the third season was coming around, Julius Schwartz, who was the DC editor at the time, it wasn't Ben Sullivan anymore, he wanted to attract a different audience, because during the time the female empowerment movement was happening, and they weren't seeing any strong superhero women in the comics. And so that's when Carmine Infantino, he created Batgirl, who was Barbara Gordon, and her first appearance came before she debuted on the live-action series in Detective Comics number 359 from January of 1967. She pretty much was Barbara Gordon, who is Commissioner James Gordon's daughter, and she admired Batman and all that he did for the city. And then one night she dresses up in her homemade costume as Batgirl, and she goes to a society party that Bruce Wayne was originally at, but then Killer Moth, the villain, was actually there and, trying to steal the money of all the rich people and everything. So Batgirl came in and helped Batman and saved the day. And even in that issue, Batman's like, this isn't a place for a woman to be. But then she's like, I don't care. This is what I love to do, and it kind of fit into that female empowerment, that kind of girl power, that anyone could be a superhero type of feel. And her character made the sales go up and really, helped with the Batman and Robin stories. And she was just a new addition to the Batman family that a lot of female, that the female audience grew from that. And I mean, so Carmine Infantino is really important for the new look, and I'm sure everyone has seen the iconic poster where Batman and Robin are kind of standing on the roof, ready to leap off, and that's been, redone by new creators all the time. And yeah, he pretty much helped Batman get out of the rut of, lack of comic sales and introduce new characters to the Batman family.
Well, then I have to thank him because my first crush was on Batgirl.
Batgirl's awesome. She is definitely one of my favorites, especially Barbara Gordon. I love her as a character. She's one of my favorites, definitely.
just that red hair. I had always a keen eye towards. Maybe because I have red hair, but that was my first crush as a little kid.
Batgirl was definitely hot. Not gonna lie.
Now, there you go. And it's actually interesting. I mean, that, Batman 66, it's called.
Right.
Right? They've reproduced that.
I know, and I love that series.
So tell me a little bit about that, because, I mean, that is essentially paying all kinds of tribute to what Infantino did, right?
Right, exactly. And especially if you watch the Batman 66 series, the live action, you will love this series. Mike Allred's work, is perfect. And they pretty much recall different episodes and bring back, villains that you didn't really see in comics, like Egghead, and one of my favorites, King Tut. Since I love Egyptology, he was always one of my favorites. But yeah, definitely it brings back the Batmania that everyone experienced in the late 60s and put it into comics. And it bums me out that it took so long for it to kind of get there with all of like the licensing and all that stuff. And now all of the Batman 66 merchandise, from the Blu-rays to the Hot Wheels to all of the collectibles,
great figures, right?
Right. All of that is now available, but yeah, the 66 series is really good, and I recommend anyone who loves the live action.
So I want to get into that now. So where are they at with 66, the comics?
Well, it first started as a digital first on the DC app. So they are a lot of issues, and I would probably say 30. So if you want to just start on the first one, you can either, I'm sure Meltdown might actually have it, or I'm sure any comic book store might have it. But the best way that I know you'll be able to read the first issue is to go on a DC Comics app and just type in, Batman 66, and they'll have it for a really low price, since it's, kind of old,
right.
now considering. But yeah, so definitely recommend that. And that's all thanks to Infantino for sure.
Wow, that is a huge contribution. We've got the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the pre-New 52, the New 52, and
Right.
probably now Convergence to even talk about. We're up at an hour right now.
Okay.
So what I think we'll do is we'll just call this part 1.
Part 1, definitely.
And then we'll come back next week, do part 2. Does that sound fair?
That sounds awesome.
Okay, great.
Definitely.
So again, thank you so much. Learning about the creators, I think, is obviously very important. At Meltdown, I think one of the big keys of the philosophy behind the store is to actually pay tribute to creators and give creators a voice. We have Meltthology, where people come and just draw. We have Zine Melt, where people get to sell their creations. And so I think it's, you can't, everyone obviously wants to get their foot in the door and do something and create and just have fun with this medium that is comic books. And I think by you focusing on Batman's creators, it's a very nice and important thing. So thank you for doing that.
No problem. I think it'll help a lot of people who, like I said, really want to start getting into reading comics, especially Batman comics. And a lot of these issues are really key moments in his history, and they may start reading it and they really like the way Carmine Infantino draws, and they might want to read more. And I even have a collector's edition of all of his works. It's under DC Comics, and it says The Art of Carmine Infantino. And they have these for pretty much all of the creators, for the most part, that we've talked about in this first session. When we go to part 2, it'll be the exact same. And so I'll definitely recommend some for people to check out.
That's great. And so if people do want to reach out to you and get these these collected editions or some recommendations, how can people contact you?
The easiest way to contact me is if you email me at historyofthebatman@gmail.com. And if you're a follower on the Instagram page, instagram.com/historyofthebatman, just shoot me a direct message and I will definitely get back to you. I love all suggestions, whether you guys want to hear a particular topic or anything. You guys have any feedback, please let me know. So email me at historyofthebatman@gmail.com.
Okay, and also every Wednesday, obviously, we're coming back and releasing new podcasts. So please tune in every Wednesday. It's like New Comic Book Day, except it's New Podcast Day for the History of the Batman.
Exactly.
All right, so we're going to talk about that next week, and we'll hit the 70s to present. Thanks again for coming in. Thank you, Shadow Adam. Always a pleasure. This is the History of the Batman at Meltdown Comics with Londyn, brought to you by Meltdown Comics, Fat Collectibles, that's PHAT Collectibles. We've also got the digital comic book platform, Comics Fix, who are sponsoring as well, so thank you for that. Again, this is the History of the Batman with Londyn at Meltdown Comics. This has been produced and engineered by Mason Booker, the Bane fan, and co-produced by me, Adam Silverstein. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.